1 Samuel chapter 14. Now a detachment of Philistines had gone out to the pass at Michmash. One day Jonathan, son of Saul, said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine post on the other side," but he did not tell his father. Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree in Migron. With him were about 600 men, among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod. He was the son of Ichabod's brother Ahitub, son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh. No one was aware that Jonathan had left. So Saul and Jonathan had separated. Jonathan had left with what seems to be just one individual or a small group that he's going out with, and he's going to investigate. Maybe he's going to see what's going on, but the Bible goes out of its way to very clearly communicate that Saul does not know that he has left the group. On each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost was a cliff, one called Bozez and the other Seneh. One cliff stood to the north toward Michmash, the other to the south. So there was a cliff between the pass where they were wanting to go. Jonathan said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of these uncircumcised men." When it says uncircumcised men, basically he's alluding to their lack of covenant with the Lord. And he says, "Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." "Do all that you have in mind," his armor-bearer said. "Go ahead, I'm with your heart and soul." Basically said, "I'm down for whatever you think is best, Jonathan. Let's do this." Jonathan said, "Come on then, we will cross over toward them and let them see us. If they say to us, 'Wait there until we come to you,' we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say to us, 'Come up to us,' we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands." Verse 11, so both of them showed themselves to the Philistines' outpost. "Look," said the Philistines, "the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they were hiding in." The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor-bearer, "Come up to us and we'll teach you a lesson." So Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, "Climb up after me, the Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." Basically he said, when we go, we'll see what they say, we'll see how they respond, and we'll believe that if they call us up, then God's giving us an advantage, that God's giving us this battle, that God's calling us into this moment. And so they begin to basically mock them and say, "Come on up, we'll teach you a lesson. We'll, come out of your little caves that you are hiding in." So they start to climb up. Jonathan climbed up using his hand and feet with his armor-bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor-bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about a half an acre. Then panic struck the whole army. Those in the camp and field and those in the outposts and raiding parties in the ground shook. It was a panic sent by the Lord. Saul's lookouts at Gibeah and Benjamin saw the army melting away in all directions. Then Saul said to the men who were with him, "Muster the forces and see who has left us." When they did, it was Jonathan and his armor-bearer who was not there. Saul said to Ahijah, "Bring the ark of God." At that time it was with the Israelites. While Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the Philistine camp increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, "Withdraw your hand." Then Saul and all his men assembled and went to the battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. Basically, God had put them in a panic. God had put them in a frenzy, and they were essentially fighting themselves. A lot of times what will happen is we can sometimes think that the enemy is getting the upper hand, and God will then allow the enemy to devour themselves. And this is what's taking place. The enemy is turned against itself. Then Saul and all his men assembled and went to the battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with swords. Those Hebrews who had previously been with the Philistines and had gone up with them to their camp went over to the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. When all the Israelites who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were on the run, they joined the battle in hot pursuit. So on that day the Lord saved Israel, and the battle moved on to beyond Beth Aven. Now the Israelites were in distress that day because Saul had bound the people under oath, saying, "Cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself of my enemies." So none of the troops tasted food. The entire army entered the woods, and there was honey on the ground. When they went into the woods, they saw the honey oozing out. Yet no one put his hand to his mouth, because they feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with the oath, so he reached out to remind you. Jonathan had separated away from the camp, and he was with his armor-bearer. So Saul had made this directive that they were fasting and that they were not eating, but Jonathan was not aware of this directive. So he was not doing something rebellious towards his king or towards his father. He just was unaware of something that his father had requested. And it says that he reached out the end of his staff that was in his hand and dipped it into the honeycomb. He raised his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. Then one of the soldiers told him, "Your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, 'Cursed be anyone who eats food today.' That's why the men are faint." Jonathan replied, "My father has made trouble for the country. See how my eyes brightened when I tasted a little of this honey? How much better would it have been if the men had eaten today some of the plunder they took from their enemies? Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been even greater? Essentially what he says, why did my dad say that? Why did he make this directive? Why did he make this ruling? Basically, he didn't know about it. And he goes, why are we not eating? He goes, we're all tired right now while we're chasing our enemy because we're not well nourished, and we could have won even more today. Basically, he doesn't understand the why behind the what. It says in verse 31, that day after the Israelites had struck down the Philistines from Michmash to Ajalon, they were exhausted. They pounced on the plunder, and taking sheep, cattle, and calves, they butchered them on the ground and ate them together with the blood. Then someone said to Saul, look, the men are sinning against the Lord by eating meat that has blood in it. You have broken faith, he said. Roll a large stone over here at once. Then he said, go out among the men and tell them, each of you bring me your cattle and sheep and slaughter them here and eat them. Do not sin against the Lord by eating meat with blood still in it. So everyone brought his ox that night and slaughtered it there. Then Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first time he had done this. Verse 36. Saul said, let us go down and pursue the Philistines by night and plunder them till dawn, and let us not leave one of them alive. Do whatever seems best to you, they replied, but the priest said, let us inquire of God here. So Saul asked God, and this is a great thing for us to learn from. They've had this moment where God uses Jonathan to begin an attack on their enemies. God throws their enemies into a panic. The people are winning. The people are pursuing. The people are trying to be intentional to honor God. They have an offering. Saul builds an altar. They're talking about what should we do next. The priest gives him counsel. He says, let's inquire of God. And Saul asks God, verse 37. It's a great lesson for us. We should always ask God before we act. And Saul didn't always do this. And oftentimes, that's what can lead to trouble or pain in our own life when we don't ask God before we act. Shall I go down and pursue the Philistines? Will you give them into Israel's hand? But God did not answer him that day. Saul therefore said, come here, all you who are leaders of the army, and let us find out what sin has been committed today. As surely as the Lord who rescued Israel lives, even if the guilt lies with my son Jonathan, he must die. But not one of them said a word. Now, Saul is, in my opinion, speaking a little rashly in this moment. He's saying, look, who did something wrong today? Who violated something? And we'll find out that it was Jonathan who ate against the oath, though he did not know that he was eating against the oath, and they're going to find that out in a little bit. Verse 40, Saul then said to all the Israelites, you stand over there, I and Jonathan my son will stand over here. Do what seems best to you, they replied. Then Saul prayed to the Lord, the God of Israel. Why have you not answered your servant today? If the fault is in me or my son Jonathan, respond with Urim, but if the men of Israel at fault, respond with Thummim. Jonathan and Saul were taken by lot, and the men were cleared. Saul said, cast a lot between me and Jonathan my son, and Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, tell me what you've done. So Jonathan told him, I tasted a little honey with the end of my staff, and now I must die. Saul said, may God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you do not die, Jonathan. But the men, so he was about to kill his own son because he ate honey, because he did not know that Saul had made an oath that none of them would eat for that day. Verse 45, but the men then said to Saul, should Jonathan die? He who has brought against his great deliverance in Israel? Never. As surely as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, for he did to this day with God's help. So the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death. So basically, all the guys saw what Jonathan had done that day, and I believe they probably knew that he didn't know about the oath that Saul had made, and they stuck up for him, and they said, come on, Saul, don't kill Jonathan over this because he ate some honey. And so Saul stopped pursuing the Philistines, and they went and drew to their own lands. And basically, they just stopped. God didn't answer them. Should they pursue? God didn't give them a next step. So they really just stopped in their tracks and just went back home. Verse 47 shares with us, after Saul had assumed rule over Israel, he fought against their enemies on every side. Basically, this is kind of segueing, like the story's kind of over, and it's segueing, giving us a little more history before chapter 15. It says that he fought Moab, the Ammonites, Edom, the kings of Zobah, and the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment on them. He fought valiantly and defeated the Amalekites, delivering Israel from the hands of those who had plundered them. Basically, all their enemies who had oppressed them over the years, he went to battle with them, and he defeated many of them, and he basically stopped the physical oppression that was taking place in Israel. Saul's sons were Jonathan, Ishvi, and Malchishua. The name of his older daughter was Merab, and that of the younger daughter was Michal. His wife's name was Ahinoam, daughter of Ahimaaz. The name of the commander of Saul's army was Abner, son of Ner, and Ner was Saul's uncle. Saul's father Kish and Abner's father Ner were sons of Abiel. All the days of Saul there was bitter war with the Philistines, and whenever Saul saw a mighty or brave man, he took him into his service. It's interesting that God ends that chapter with that phraseology, that there was war that took place between Saul and the Philistines. So even though they were no longer, quote unquote, being oppressed by these nations, they were always at war and in conflict. God said to them, if you take a king, if you reject me as your king, and you take a man as a king, he will take taxes, he will take the best of your sons, he'll take the best of your daughters, he will use them for his chariots and for his purposes. And the Bible goes out of its way to say that they were constantly in conflict, and that whenever Saul saw a brave man, he took him into his army. What does it mean? They had traded one covering for a different kind of covering. That's what Israel did. They traded the covering of the Lord for the covering of man. And God warned them, and he said, look, I'm telling you, you're making a bad deal. But they said, we want a king so that we can be like every other nation. And right now, you see Saul is winning some of his battles. You see Saul is doing well, and everyone probably got excited. But what we're going to soon find out in the next few chapters is that Saul, like all of us, was just a man. And Saul was susceptible to pride, and Saul was susceptible to sin. And there were seasons in Saul's life where he didn't honor the Lord the way that he should have. And it brought about even more trouble in Israel. Let's learn from this as we continue in 1 Samuel. Be blessed today.